we don't expand our imagination,
justification for being what it was.
And welcome to Washington Unplugged. I'm Bill Plant. Last night, President Obama hailed the end of the U.S. combat mission in Iraq as a promise kept. He asked the American people to turn the page. He thanked the million U.S. troops who have served in Iraq, and he praised their dedication and sacrifice. He gave a shout out to former President Bush, but he admitted that he and President Bush had disagreed about the war. He praised Bush for his support of the troops and love of country, but he didn't mention the fact that he had opposed the former president's troop surge. He talked about the other war, Afghanistan, where the U.S. faces big problems. But in the end, Mr. Obama shifted focus toward the biggest concern of most Americans, and that is, of course, the economy.
Ending this war is not only in Iraq's interest, it's in our own. The United States has paid a huge price to put the future of Iraq in the hands of its people. We have sent our young men and women to make enormous sacrifices in Iraq and spent vast resources abroad at a time of tight budgets at home. We've persevered because of a belief we share with the Iraqi people, a belief that out of the ashes of war, a new beginning could be born in this cradle of civilization. Through this remarkable chapter in the history of the United States and Iraq, we have met our responsibilities. Now, it's time to turn the page.
So let's talk about Iraq first. The question is Iraq ready to stand on its own? I'm joined right now by Marc Ambinder, who is the chief CBS News political consultant, and by Cami McCormick, a war correspondent for CBS who has covered Iraq and Afghanistan extensively. And Cami, let me start with you. This pullout, this deadline, it seems artificial, and the Iraqis hardly seem ready to stand on their own.
Well, I think, you know, anytime you have troops are trained in combat. They fully expect to go to combat if they're called upon to do so. So there have been some analysts who have suggested this is a political deadline, this is a political anniversary, a political celebration. I think the troops on the ground would say that they're continuing to do the same job they've done over the past several months, which is to train the Iraqis, to work with them. Special operations forces are still in the country. Obviously, a lot is riding on what happens in the months ahead in Iraq, but as we've seen in the past, there have been many highs and lows. So the U.S. military will have to be prepared regardless.
Well, they changed the name of the operation, and they changed it from combat to support. But the troops still have all their weapons. Right,
and they will argue that they've pulled U.S. troops out of the cities months ago, many months ago. So those troops were still engaged in combat when they needed to be. They were still assisting the Iraqis in counterterrorism efforts and special operations efforts. So I think on the ground, the job for the U.S. soldier will be much the same as it has been.
Let's go to the political implications here. Marc, what did you think of the president's speech?
I thought it was a very political speech in the ultimate non-political setting, which is, of course, the Oval Office, when the president is acting as the commander-in-chief presiding over all Americans. But he was making a very political argument that ties directly into the economy, which is that President Bush and the Bush administration made the choice to go into Iraq. And the resulting hundreds of billions of dollars, time, money, resources that were diverted to that war could have been diverted to rebuilding. Obama used the word several times, rebuilding domestic infrastructure, healthcare, education, put toward those.
And he mentioned the money figure, the trillions.
He mentioned that we've spent more than $1 trillion in Iraq. And so his argument is, to the American people who are concerned about the economy, the end of the combat mission in Iraq marks a turning point away from 7 years of an entire way of governing that, you know, moved us into recession, that moved us into, or that drove the government to choose the wrong priorities. And what Obama essentially was saying was, this is one reason why it's been so hard to extract ourselves, but I keep my promises as president, and we're going to start to rebuild beginning now. There's going to be a peace dividend of sorts coming from all the money that we would have spent in Iraq.
Yeah, well, back to this whole idea of the artificial timeline. These are deadlines set by the president himself. And he says further that we're going to have all of American troops out of Iraq by the end of next year, 2011.
I think we'll have to wait and see. The Obama administration, referring to Afghanistan, has been very quick to add, if conditions on the ground warrant. I think that might be the same situation in Iraq. Obviously, everyone's watching to see if Iraq gets a government soon. What happens in the process of it getting a government? There are two schools of thought on that. One is don't rush them because it needs to be done right. This is going to lay the groundwork for the future. The other argument is the longer this deadlock goes on, the more dangerous the place becomes, and the insurgents are watching this and hoping to take advantage of it. So I think to say that we will be out the door at such a date in Iraq is wishful thinking. I think we have to wait and see how this all plays out. We've seen Iraq over the years with these highs and lows. I think we could still see some of those in the future.
Well, and then you've got Afghanistan immediately following. Here's Afghanistan, and more promises have been made. The pullout begins at the end of July 2011. And they've been careful to say, well, it'll be only as many as we can afford to pull out at first. But the American public is no more happy with the commitment to Afghanistan than it was with Iraq.
And there's also the argument, on one hand, that you're giving the insurgents a date in which you'll be leaving, and so they will sit and wait. And then you want to please the American public and say that there is an exit strategy to this war in Afghanistan as well. So again, I think the Obama administration will fall back on if conditions on the ground warrant before we're going to see any major reduction of forces in Afghanistan.
Marc, you talked about the administration hoping for a peace dividend. 70-some-odd% of the public thinks that the war was a bad idea, the war in Iraq to begin with. And we're going to be committed there, either militarily or with a massive civilian presence for years to come. Where's the dividend going to come from?
I don't know if there is going to be a financial dividend, and that's one reason why I think the president was more trying to tell a story that the American people perhaps could understand, rather than actively talking about the fact that, well, we spent $100 billion per year in Iraq, and now we'll spend 50 and we can spend that at home. And that's just not the way that wars are and have been funded. I mean, one of the larger, deeper stories about the parlous condition of the economy is the ad hoc way that we've funded our wars and all the obligations we still have to pay. So we still have to pay a lot of what we owe to fight, or that we owe for what we've already fought in Iraq. But I think Obama is a guy who uses the word narrative a lot, and he really tries to tell a story. And this story begins with Iraq, and it ends with, ultimately in the future, American troops coming home from Afghanistan, the Al-Qaeda network being significantly degraded, and the economy beginning to improve because we're finally focusing on our resources at home. Will the American people buy that story? Maybe. In time for the midterms? Probably not.
In time for the midterms, doesn't look like there's anything going to happen.
Much of anything. You see the White House floating some potential tax cuts today. I think it's a little bit too late for them to really change what I think is a very, very regimented and hardened opinion of the president and the Democrats in the mind of those who are going to be voting in November.
Cami, I want to give you a chance before we wrap this segment to talk about the changes you've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan in the years that you've covered there.
Yeah, it's been so volatile from the first couple of days after the invasion, going into Baghdad with U.S. soldiers and walking the streets and the shopkeepers welcoming them. And even then, just a couple of days after the invasion, saying, when are we going to get electricity back? When are we going to get jobs? So we knew immediately that was something very important in Iraq. And then to see highs such as the first election in Iraq, where so many people, especially in the Shiite areas, turned out. I was with U.S. Marines. Immediately following that, the first day after the election, 5 Marines I was with were blown up and killed in a roadside bomb. To see the election where the Sunnis turned out for the first time, and then see the resurgence in violence in Ambar, and then the Sunni awakening. So there have been so many ups and downs in this conflict. It's hard to say, even having watched it and having been in the middle of it for as long as I was, where things will go from here.
I want to leave it at that. It's a good question, isn't it? I mean, a perplexing question. Cami McCormick, thank you very much. Marc Ambinder, always a pleasure. And we will turn to the other equally crucial item on the president's agenda this week, and that is the renewed peace talks between Israel and the Palestinians. President Obama plunging into Mideast peacemaking. In last night's speech, he called it a new push for peace. So what obstacles stand in the way, and is a one-year timetable realistic? CBS News foreign affairs analyst Pam Falk in New York, and David Makovsky of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy are with me now to discuss the new round of talks. Pam, welcome.
Welcome. Nice to be here, Bill.
So, Pam, we know that you spoke on Monday with the Israeli ambassador to the United States, Gabriela Shalev. Tell us what she said, or show us what she said.
She was very upbeat, and Ambassador Shalev, the ambassador of Israel to the United Nations, was upbeat about the chance of Middle East peace. Her point was that there can only be peace if the parties talk. This is a restarting of talks that have been faltered for 20 months. In addition, they've been unhinged since 1979. Her point was also that it's the Palestinians, not the Israelis, that have to decide who is the negotiator for the Palestinians, and the talks are going to be between Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel and Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, who of course is the president of the Palestinian Authority based in the West Bank.
So Pam, thank you for correcting me. I should have said she's the ambassador of Israel to the UN, and we do have your interview on camera. Let's take a look.
The Palestinians understand that there's no other way to come and to achieve their aspiration, namely a Palestinian state living side by side with Israel as the homeland of the Jewish people, unless we will come and talk. They elected the Hamas in Gaza, and we're not going to sit with the Hamas. I mean, would you speak with somebody that wants to murder you? It doesn't make sense. But the Palestinians amongst themselves have to decide. We see the Palestinian Authority as the legitimate government of the Palestinian people. They have to decide for their own fate. They should look and see the law and order and the economics that is taking place in the West Bank.
So she puts the burden on the Palestinians, Pam. And
Absolutely.
What, in your opinion, is Israel likely to do here?
Well, Israel is looking for a set of negotiations, and Prime Minister Netanyahu asked for bi-monthly, 2 times a month meetings with the Palestinians. At first, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas rejected that, but now it looks like there may be a continuing set of negotiations. The Israelis are looking for no preconditions, and that seems to be very different from what the Palestinians want, which is to begin the discussion from the 1967 parameters, and that is a very different question. However, everything is on the table, and she was probably one of the few people, Bill, who was very upbeat about the negotiations. She thinks it can happen in a year, basically because Netanyahu's view is that this should be a bottom-up negotiation. Start with the idea that the big picture, a two-state solution, having a Palestinian state independent and Israel as a recognized state by the Palestinians, can be the beginning, not the end to the negotiations. And then you can get to those issues that have unhinged the talk since 1979.
Okay,
the right of Jerusalem and all the other issues.
Right, the so-called final status issues. Let's go to David Makovsky.
Precisely.
And here we are. This has not yet begun, or has barely begun, and there's an outbreak after a year with Hamas murdering 4 people in Israel.
Yeah, we've had about 3 years of quiet in the West Bank, and that's really the unsung story of the Israelis and the Palestinian Authority's security systems really working hand in glove to ensure that Hamas in Gaza does not gain a foothold in the West Bank, because people feel if you didn't like the book in Gaza, you certainly don't want to see the movie in the West Bank. So they've worked together, and Hamas is trying to spoil. We don't know if Iran has been a part of this or not. They clearly get money. I had lunch with President Abbas in Ramallah just a few weeks ago, and he told me, you know, the Iranians give $500 million to Hamas, and they're also true believers. And so they will try to spoil. The hope is that unlike the 90s, which was the last big effort under President Bill Clinton after the Oslo breakthrough of 1993, Hamas was very potent in its ability to be a spoiler, because there was a sense that Yasser Arafat, who headed the Palestinians at that time, felt that was actually a good thing, that if it's a wink and a nod, because violence could be a tool of negotiations and prod further Israeli concessions.
But Abbas is seen differently?
Abbas is seen very differently. No one believes he's working hand in gloves with Hamas. They're at complete odds. The question is not if he is being duplicitous. The question is he effective against Hamas? Is he strong enough to stop Hamas? No one's going to say Abbas is giving winks and nods. This isn't the 90s. But they'll say, well, we heard the Israeli-Palestinian cooperation is so fantastic, why can't they stop these attacks? And Hamas wants to show up Abbas and say, all your security cooperation with the Israelis are nothing. We can find you any place, any time, and blow up innocent people.
So Pam has heard from the Israelis that they actually consider the year deadline realistic. That seems odd to many people who've watched the process for many years.
I mean, I think it's...
Go ahead, Pam.
Just that I'm glad you brought up Iran. Ambassador Shalev's view was that there were a few things that made this negotiations possible. One is the chemistry, curiously, even though there was tensions between Netanyahu and Obama, and she felt that they were both leaders who wanted a solution. The second is the fact that the Palestinian territories are worse off, and the third is the one you previously mentioned, which is Iran. Iran's moving closer to having a nuclear weapon, if they are, or at least toward uranium enrichment, and that has put pressure on the timetable. So she was one of the few people that's actually upbeat.
And David, your view?
I believe that this is there's four key issues in what you mentioned as final status, and that is the borders of the Palestinian state, and the security arrangements for those borders. Second issue. Third issue, the issue of refugees. The fourth, the issue of Jerusalem. The issues of borders and security, I'm more upbeat about. I actually have a study coming out on it because I believe when it comes to those two issues, both sides knows what the other one wants and what the other one needs. And therefore, I wouldn't say the differences are minor, but I would say they're not insurmountable. When you deal with Jerusalem and refugees, you're dealing with what I would call the two issues of narrative and the cut to the self-definition of these two parties, Israelis and Palestinians. And so all these under-the-radar policy shifts on borders and security, you cannot sweep those issues under the rug when you come to these very emotional, potent symbols. And what I think is required on Jerusalem and refugees is a lot of conditioning of the societal landscape. And what I've learned, having been around the block a few times on this thing, is that when the leaders don't tell the publics that they're going to compromise on those issues, they don't compromise. And that there needs to be a period of preparation. And we don't see that yet. So I will be more optimistic about the year deadline when I start seeing that conditioning going on. But I think on borders and security, they could do something real. I like sports metaphors, so I tend to think if it's all or nothing in the Middle East, it's the equivalent in football of throwing a Hail Mary pass. You're on your goal line, you hope, pray someone catches it, but it hardly ever works. It's usually either an incomplete pass or an interception.
True.
So you're better off throwing a screen pass and taking the ball 70 yards down the field on borders and security. Have you scored a touchdown? No. But you're much better positioned than where you are now. And why is that so crucial? Because the publics on both sides, having witnessed the failures of the 90s, have become cynical. They're exhausted. And they believe that nothing is going to work. We've seen peace ceremonies. We've seen Oval Office speeches. We've seen it all. And yet we don't see a solution. And what you really need to do is embolden and energize these constituencies on both camps, in both sides that existed, and get them to believe again. Because if the centers of these societies believe again, their leaders will be energized in going further.
A very tall order.
It's a tall order.
David Makovsky of the Washington Institute for Middle East Peace, and Pamela Falk, our UN correspondent and another person who follows the Middle East very closely. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good to be here, Bill.
Thank you for watching Washington Unplugged. Catch us every day here on CBSNews.com. I'm Bill Plant. Have a great day.